You're basically worth more alive than dead right now." My brother-in-law laughed when he said it. He leaned back so far in his cheap plastic patio chair that I thought the legs were going to snap, taking another long pull from his beer. Everyone at the table laughed right along with him. My husband, Jake, chuckled while flipping a burger on the grill, and my mother-in-law, Linda, let out this light, airy giggle from her pristine lounge chair. I smiled too. I didn't even think about it. My mouth just formed the shape of a smile because at that point, I still genuinely thought it was a joke. It was a hot, sticky July afternoon. We were having a family barbecue, and I just assumed it was Tyler being Tyler, tasteless, loud, and completely oblivious to social boundaries. It wasn't a joke. 3 weeks later, I found the policy. It was sitting right there on my computer screen, a crisp, official digital document staring back at me. It had my name. It had my social security number. And right there on the designated line, it had my mother-in-law listed as the sole beneficiary. To make you understand how deeply twisted that discovery was and how I ended up sitting at that patio table paying for the very food they were eating while they joked about my death, I have to take you back. I have to explain exactly how I became the designated ATM for the Carter family. My name is Emily Carter. I am 31 years old, and I work as an ICU nurse at a massive, perpetually understaffed hospital right in the heart of Chicago. If you know anything about the intensive care unit, you know it is not just a career, it is an all-consuming lifestyle. You don't just clock in and clock out. You absorb the trauma, the beeping of the life support machines, the smell of sterile wipes and sickness, and you carry it home with you in your bones. I work 12-hour shifts that almost always stretch into 14. I am trained to fix things, to stabilize crises, and to keep people breathing when their bodies want to give up. That fundamental need to fix things is exactly what made me the perfect target. When I first met Jake Carter, he felt like a deep breath of fresh air. I had lost my own parents when I was in my early 20s, leaving me completely alone in the world navigating adulthood. Jake, on the other hand, came from this big, tight-knit group. There was his mother, Linda, who always seemed to have a warm casserole and a hug waiting. His father, Ron, a quiet guy who loved his armchair. And his younger brother, Tyler, who was a bit of a mess but always the life of the party. I didn't just fall in love with Jake. I fell head over heels in love with the idea of the Carters. I wanted a family so desperately that I completely ignored the glaring warning signs. I didn't realize that I wasn't being welcomed into their fold as a daughter or a sister. I was being recruited for a job. The financial bleeding didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, insidious process, starting with a tragedy that nobody could have predicted. My father-in-law, Ron, got sick. His kidneys started failing rapidly, and before we knew it, he was put on a grueling schedule for dialysis. I remember the exact night the trap was set. Jake came home, walked straight into our bedroom, and just collapsed onto the edge of the mattress. He buried his face in his hands and started sobbing. He told me that his parents' Medicare was only covering a fraction of the treatments. The out-of-pocket costs for the dialysis were astronomical, and his parents were drowning. He looked up at me, his eyes red and desperate, and told me they were going to lose their house. The family home where he grew up was going to be foreclosed on to pay for his dad's medical bills. What was I supposed to do? I'm a nurse. My entire existence revolves around saving lives. I couldn't sit in my comfortable apartment and watch my husband cry over his dying father. So, I stepped up. I told Jake not to worry. I immediately went to my charge nurse and started picking up every single piece of overtime I could get my hands on. I worked nights. I worked holidays. I worked weekends when everyone else was out having a life. Every extra dollar I made, I quietly transferred into an account to pay for Ron's dialysis. I paid for his life-saving treatments, telling myself that this is what families do for each other. They sacrifice. But the moment I opened my wallet, the dynamic shifted permanently. The Carters realized they had a golden goose, and they stopped trying to swim. They just let me pull them. About a year after Ron started his treatments, Linda suddenly developed severe issues with her knees. She claimed the pain was unbearable and that she needed double knee replacement surgeries. Now, her standard insurance would have covered a perfectly competent, board-certified orthopedic surgeon at our local community hospital. But Linda wouldn't hear of it. She sat me down over coffee, dabbing at her dry eyes, and gave me a long, dramatic speech about how her body was delicate. She insisted she absolutely needed a top-tier, out-of-network specialist in the city. If I don't get this specific doctor, Emily, I just know I'll be in a wheelchair, she told me, her voice trembling perfectly. I'll be a burden on you and Jake forever. Jake, of course, panicked. He begged me. She's my mom, Em. She's in so much pain. We have to help her. So the cycle repeated. I picked up more shifts. My feet ached so badly at the end of the day that I would literally sit in my car in the hospital parking garage and cry before driving home. I paid for Linda's out-of-network surgeries. I paid the massive surgeon's fee. And when she refused to go to the standard rehabilitation clinic because the fluorescent lights gave her a headache, I paid for a private, in-home physical therapist. Then there was Tyler. Tyler is 30-something years old and has never held down a real job for more than 6 months. He is always one pitch away from becoming a millionaire, constantly launching absurd startup ideas that inevitably crash and burn. When his latest venture, an app that literally no one asked for, went under, he spiraled into what Linda diagnosed as a severe existential crisis. According to my mother-in-law, her youngest boy was deeply depressed and needed intense psychological intervention. Tyler didn't go to a standard therapist. He found a boutique, out-of-pocket wellness counselor that charged $300 an hour. Jake looked at me across the dinner table one night, avoiding my eyes, and said Tyler was in a dark place. He asked if we could just spot him for a few months. A few months turned into 2 years. I paid for my brother-in-law's therapy. I paid for him to sit on a leather couch and complain about how the universe was keeping him from success, all while I was quite literally wiping patients' bodies and running code blues to fund his sessions. Even Jake wasn't exempt from the medical drain. Whenever he got slightly stressed at his comfortable, air-conditioned office job, he would develop these sudden, agonizing phantom stomach pains. It always happened in the middle of the night. He would wake up groaning, clutching his stomach, convinced his appendix was bursting or he had an ulcer. We would rush to the ER, often the very ER where I worked, and they would run thousands of dollars worth of scans, blood work, and MRIs. Every single time, the results came back completely clear. Anxiety, they said. Stress. But every single visit generated a massive hospital bill. And because I was the one who managed our household finances, I was the one who quietly logged online and paid for my husband's ER visits. I was exhausted. I was living on black coffee, protein bars, and pure, unfiltered adrenaline. I rarely saw my friends. I rarely slept. I was effectively working myself to the bone to fund the existence of 4 grown adults. But they knew exactly how to play the game. They knew how to keep me on the hook without making me feel used. They weaponized their gratitude. Whenever I cleared a massive bill or handed over my credit card, they would shower me with praise. Linda would hug me so tight I could barely breathe, kissing my cheek. Jake would look at me with absolute adoration. "Oh, Emily," they would say, their voices thick with manufactured emotion. "You are our lifesaver." They called me their lifesaver. And my stupid, desperate, love-starved brain ate it up. I convinced myself that the exhaustion was worth it because I was finally part of a family that valued me. I thought they loved me. That brings us right back to the barbecue. Act 2 of my nightmare. It was a Sunday. I had just come off a brutal string of 4-night shifts in the ICU. My brain was foggy, my body was aching, and all I wanted to do was sleep for 3 days straight. But Linda had insisted on a family barbecue to celebrate summer, and of course, I was the one who bought the premium steaks, the craft beer, and the side dishes. I was sitting at the patio table, zoning out listening to them talk. The conversation somehow drifted toward finances and the rising costs of living. Tyler was complaining about how hard it was to survive in this economy, a rich statement coming from a guy whose therapy was entirely subsidized by my sweat. That was when Tyler leaned back in his chair, pointed the neck of his beer bottle at me, and delivered the line that would eventually burn my marriage to the ground. "If Emily drops dead, we're screwed," Tyler said, laughing loudly. Jake chuckled, flipping the meat. I forced a tired smile, thinking it was just a crude joke about how much I worked. But then Linda chimed in. She didn't scold Tyler. She didn't say, "Don't talk like that, we love Emily." Instead, she took a slow, delicate sip of her iced tea, looked at me with completely dead eyes, and laughed. "Don't worry," Linda said lightly. "She's insured." Sitting there in the heat, my nurse brain immediately translated that as a health insurance joke. I worked for a massive hospital network, so I had premium health coverage. I honestly thought she meant that if I collapsed from a heart attack due to exhaustion, my hospital would patch me up and I wouldn't have to pay a massive bill. I thought it was a dark, ironic joke about my job. The audience looking in from the outside would realize the horrifying truth long before I did. She wasn't talking about my health insurance at all. She was talking about a life insurance payout. I brushed the comment off, burying it under the mountain of fatigue that was my daily life. But the universe has a funny way of ripping the blinders off your eyes when you refuse to take them off yourself. The real turning point, the exact moment the trap snapped shut around my ankle and drew blood, happened a few weeks later. We were at Linda and Ron's house for our mandatory Sunday dinner. The roast I had paid for was cleared from the table, and the casual chatter died down into an uncomfortable, heavy silence. Linda walked into the dining room carrying her purse. She pulled out a thick, folded piece of paper and walked deliberately over to my side of the table. With a heavy, dramatic sigh, she slid the paper across the polished wood directly toward me. I looked down. It was a hospital bill from one of her recent, essential, post-op complication visits. I let my tired eyes trace down the long, itemized list of charges. Bandages, consultations, facility fees. And then at the very bottom, in bold black ink, was the total. $22,000. All the air rushed out of my lungs. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. $22,000. That wasn't a copay. That wasn't a deductible. That was the price of a car. It was an astronomical, crippling amount of money. Linda stood over me, looking down with an expression that was supposedly apologetic but felt incredibly cold. She didn't ask if we could help. She didn't ask how we could manage it. She just tapped the paper with her perfectly manicured fingernail. "You'll cover this, right?" Linda asked. For the very first time in 5 years, for the first time since I had stepped into the role of the provider, I hesitated. The sheer, audacious magnitude of the demand finally broke through my conditioning. I didn't reach for my purse. I didn't nod. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the number. I looked up at Jake across the table. I looked at my husband, silently begging him to intervene. I needed him to protect me. I needed him to tell his mother that this was insane, that we couldn't just casually absorb a $22,000 bill. Jake didn't look conflicted. He didn't look stressed. His face went entirely blank, his eyes hardening into something cold and unrecognizable. He looked at me, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of love. "They're my parents, Emily," Jake said. The pressure in that room was suffocating. 4 pairs of eyes staring at me, waiting for me to submit, waiting for the machine to dispense the cash. My hands shook as I reached out and folded the paper. I tucked it into my bag. I paid it, but something inside me completely snapped. I paid that $22,000 bill, just like I had paid for every single other crisis they threw my way, but the drive home that night felt entirely different. The silence in my car was suffocating. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't roll down the windows to feel the warm summer breeze. I just gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white, my mind replaying that cold, dead look in Jake's eyes when he told me, "They're my parents, Emily." It wasn't a request for partnership. It was a command from a manager to a subordinate. I had spent half a decade thinking I was his wife, his equal, his partner in navigating the difficult waters of adult life. But sitting in the driver's seat of my Honda, the ugly, undeniable truth started to seep into my bones. I was a utility. I was a resource to be tapped until I ran completely dry. The next morning, the exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I dragged myself out of bed, drank a cup of leftover, lukewarm coffee, and drove to the hospital for another grueling 12-hour shift in the ICU. The hospital was a chaotic symphony of beeping monitors, frantic pages over the intercom, and the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic. Usually, the adrenaline of the ICU kept me grounded, but that day, I was walking around in a complete daze. My body was automatically checking for drips, administering medications, and charting vitals, but my mind was trapped at that dining room table, staring at the bolded total of $22,000. I needed to figure out how many more graveyard shifts I would have to pick up to financially recover from this latest blow. I needed to do the math. During my 30-minute lunch break, I retreated to the small, windowless employee break room at the end of the hall. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a headache-inducing buzz. I sat down at one of the cheap laminate tables, pulled my laptop out of my locker, and logged into the hospital's HR portal. I wanted to check my accrued overtime hours and see if I could cash out some of my paid time off to cover Linda's massive, unnecessary medical debt. I clicked through the familiar drop-down menus, my eyes scanning the screen. Payroll, time and attendance, benefits. I clicked on the Benefits tab, expecting to see my standard employee health, dental, and vision insurance summaries. I scrolled past the usual information, but then my cursor hovered over something I didn't recognize. There was an entirely separate folder sitting right there on the screen. I clicked on it. It opened a new page detailing a life insurance policy, specifically an employer supplemental policy. I frowned, leaning closer to the glowing screen. I rubbed my tired eyes, thinking maybe the exhaustion was finally making me hallucinate. Standard hospital coverage provided a basic death benefit, sure. But this wasn't basic. This was a massive, premium, top-tier supplemental policy. It was the kind of policy you specifically opt into, the kind that costs a significant chunk of money out of every single paycheck. I opened the attached PDF document to look at the details. The digital paperwork loaded slowly, line by line. There was my full name. There was my date of birth. There was my social security number, my employee ID, and my home address. Everything was perfectly accurate. But then my eyes drifted down to the section that designated the payout in the event of my death. I stopped breathing. The hum of the fluorescent lights faded into absolute, ringing silence. Right there, typed in crisp, black, undeniable letters, was the beneficiary, Linda Carter. I just sat there staring at the screen. My brain fundamentally refused to process the information. Linda Carter. My mother-in-law. I blinked hard, expecting the name to change to Jake, or to a blank space, or to literally anything else. But it didn't change. I read it again and again and again. I never set that up. I would never, in a million lifetimes, actively bypass my own husband to list his mother as the sole recipient of a massive financial payout in the event of my tragic death. It didn't make any logical sense. And then, like a lightning strike, the memory of that blisteringly hot summer barbecue violently crashed into my mind. Tyler leaning back in his cheap plastic chair, laughing loudly over his craft beer. If Emily drops dead, we're screwed. Jake chuckling while flipping the burgers. And Linda taking a delicate sip of her iced tea, completely unbothered, her voice light and airy. Don't worry. She's insured. I had thought it was a health insurance joke. I had genuinely, naively believed they were making a dark, tasteless joke about my hospital medical coverage. My stomach violently turned over. I clamped a hand over my mouth, desperately fighting the sudden, overwhelming urge to vomit right there in the hospital break room. They weren't joking about my excellent health benefits. They were talking about a life insurance policy. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely unlock my phone. I frantically scrolled through the HR portal until I found the contact number for the third-party insurance agency that handled the hospital's supplemental benefits. I practically ran out of the break room, pushing through the heavy double doors and stepping into a quiet, deserted stairwell where no one could hear me. I dialed the number, pressing the phone so hard against my ear that it physically hurt. The hold music was a cheerful, upbeat jazz tune that felt like a twisted, mocking soundtrack to my unraveling reality. After what felt like an eternity, a customer service agent picked up the line. Her name was Sarah, and she had a bright, professional voice. "How can I help you today?" she asked. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to force my voice to sound level and professional.
Hi, Sarah.
My name is Emily Carter. I am an employee at the hospital network, and I'm looking at my benefits portal. I see a supplemental life insurance policy listed here, and I need you to give me the entire history of this account. Every single detail. I went through the security verification process, confirming my identity, my social security number, and my employee badge number. I could hear Sarah typing rapidly on her keyboard. Okay, Mrs. Carter, I have your file pulled up, the insurance agent said over the call. What exactly would you like to know? When was this policy purchased? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. There was a brief pause, accompanied by more clicking. It looks like this supplemental policy was purchased exactly 3 years ago, she replied. 3 years ago. My mind instantly raced backward. 3 years ago was the exact same time Ron's kidneys had started failing. 3 years ago was the exact moment the massive financial drain had begun, when Jake had cried on the edge of our bed and begged me to save his parents' house. That was when the trap was originally set. How was it authorized? I demanded, the panic starting to morph into a hot, burning anger. I don't remember signing any physical paperwork for this. It wasn't a physical document, ma'am. It was signed electronically, Sarah explained, through the online employee portal. The authorization was completed digitally. Can you tell me where it was signed from? Is there an IP address attached to that digital signature? I asked, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Yes, we do log the IP addresses for security purposes, she said. She read a long string of numbers out loud to me. I closed my eyes, pressing my back against the cold, cinder-block wall of the stairwell. I didn't even need to write the numbers down to check them later. I recognized them instantly. It was the IP address of our shared home computer, the desktop that sat in the small, cluttered office of the house I paid the mortgage for. My husband had logged into my private employee portal. He had navigated through my HR benefits, set up a premium life insurance policy on my life, and forged my digital signature. But I needed to know the full extent of the rot. I swallowed hard, my throat feeling completely dry. Sarah, can you check the beneficiary history? Has it always been Linda Carter? Let me check that for you, she murmured. I listened to the sound of her keyboard, every click feeling like a nail being driven into a coffin. Here we go. No, it hasn't always been Linda Carter. The beneficiary has actually been changed twice since the policy was initiated. Tell me, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Initially, when the policy was opened 3 years ago, the primary beneficiary was listed as Jake Carter, Sarah explained. Then, about a year after that, an amendment was filed, and the beneficiary was changed to a split, Jake Carter and Linda Carter. She paused, and I knew what was coming next. I braced myself. And then, the final change was made just 6 months ago, Sarah concluded. The beneficiary was updated one last time. Jake Carter was removed entirely, and Linda Carter was listed as the sole beneficiary. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in the quiet stairwell, the reality of her words washing over me like ice water. Emily realizes. Jake and Linda did it. They had conspired together. They had sat down at the computer in my own home, the home I worked 14-hour shifts to afford, and they had quietly calculated the exact monetary value of my life. My husband had orchestrated a horrific contingency plan with his mother. If the sheer, crushing stress of working endless ICU shifts and funding their lavish, out-of-network medical lifestyles finally caused my heart to give out, Linda would get a massive payday. Jake wouldn't even have to deal with the messy optics of collecting the money. His mother would hold the purse strings, ensuring the Carter family remained perfectly financially secure while I was buried 6 feet under the ground. I thanked Sarah, hung up the phone, and slowly slid down the cinder-block wall until I was sitting on the hard concrete floor of the stairwell. I didn't cry. There were absolutely no tears left in my body. The profound sense of betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that it bypassed sadness entirely and went straight to a terrifying, clinical numbness. Most people would have stormed out of the hospital right then and there. They would have driven home, kicked the front door open, waved the printed policy in their spouse's face, and screamed until their vocal cords bled. They would have demanded answers, thrown plates, and filed for divorce in a fiery rage. But I am an ICU nurse. I am highly trained to handle catastrophic, life-threatening emergencies with cold, calculated precision. When a patient crashes, you do not panic. You do not scream. You stabilize, you secure the airway, you prepare the life-saving interventions, and you ensure your footing is solid before you make a single sudden move. So, I did what I do best. Emily says nothing. I stood up, smoothed out my scrubs, and walked back through the double doors into the chaotic ICU. I finished my 12-hour shift. I smiled at my coworkers. I diligently charted my vitals. I held the hand of a scared patient, and I walked out to my car the next morning as if my entire universe hadn't just been completely obliterated. When I finally got home, the house was quiet. The morning sun was just starting to filter through the blinds. I walked into our bedroom and saw Jake fast asleep in our bed. His chest was rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He looked completely relaxed, completely untroubled by the massive weight of the secret he was keeping from me. I stood at the foot of the bed and looked at him for a long time. I felt absolutely nothing. No love, no anger, no resentment. Just a profound, chilling detachment. I was looking at a stranger. A dangerous, parasitic stranger who had infiltrated my life. The silence before the storm is always the deadliest part of any hurricane. I didn't confront him. Instead, I quietly went to work building my exit strategy. Over the next few days, while Jake went to his comfortable office job and Linda enjoyed her private physical therapy sessions, I became a ghost in my own life. I systematically, ruthlessly dismantled every single piece of the safety net they had come to rely on. First, I logged back into the HR portal. With a few swift, decisive clicks, I removed every single dependent from my premium health insurance plan. Jake, Linda, Ron, Tyler, they were all instantly, permanently wiped off my coverage. Let them navigate the brutal American healthcare system without my hospital-subsidized shield. Next, I went into my legitimate retirement accounts and my basic life insurance policies, the ones I actually knew about, and I changed the beneficiaries. I removed Jake's name and redirected everything to a charity that supported the families of terminal patients. Let them try to collect a dime from that. Then I moved to our finances. I separated finances completely. I drove to a completely different banking institution across town, one that Jake had no connection to, and I opened a brand new, private checking and savings account. I went to my hospital's payroll department and immediately redirected my direct deposits to the new account. I logged into our joint bank account, calculated exactly half of our shared savings, and transferred it out. I didn't take a single penny more than what was mine, leaving exactly his portion, so he couldn't accuse me of theft later. Finally, I began compiling the evidence. I spent hours in our shared home office, waiting until Jake was asleep. I dug through filing cabinets, digital folders, and old email receipts. I made meticulous copies of documents. Every single medical bill I had paid over the last 5 years, every bank transfer to Ron's dialysis center, every credit card statement showing Tyler's exorbitant therapy sessions, and of course, the fraudulent life insurance policy with the forged digital signature. I printed everything out. I organized it chronologically into a thick, heavy manila folder. I was building an impenetrable fortress of evidence, brick by brick, while they all still foolishly thought I was their obedient, exhausted little workhorse. The tension was building inside me, a tightly coiled spring waiting for the exact right moment to snap. I knew a storm was coming. The audience could feel the tension building. And I was going to make absolutely sure that the Carter family was standing completely unprotected in the pouring rain when the lightning finally struck. For 3 agonizing days, I lived a complete and utter double life inside my own home. It was a terrifying psychological exercise in absolute detachment. I would wake up in the morning, pour myself a cup of coffee, and ask Jake how his sleep was, all while perfectly knowing that he had legally forged my signature to place a bounty on my head. I would listen to him complain about the mild, everyday stresses of his comfortable office job, nodding sympathetically, while the heavy manila folder of evidence sat hidden in the trunk of my car like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. The The silence I maintained was deafening to my own ears, but they were all so incredibly self-absorbed, so deeply accustomed to my quiet subservience, that none of them noticed the dramatic shift in my demeanor. They just thought the ATM was quietly doing its job. But the universe, it seems, has a very dramatic sense of timing. I had been waiting for the exact right moment to drop the bomb, but the universe decided to force my hand on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was at the hospital, just finishing up my charting for the morning, when my cell phone started buzzing violently in my scrub pocket. I pulled it out and saw Linda's name flashing frantically on the screen. For a brief second, I considered just letting it go to voicemail. But the trained nurse inside of me, the instinct that responds to crises, made me swipe to answer. Before I could even say hello, Linda's hysterical, shrill voice pierced through the speaker. She was hyperventilating, her words jumbled and panicked. Ron had collapsed. She said he was walking from the kitchen to his armchair when his eyes simply rolled back into his head, and he hit the hardwood floor like a sack of bricks. He was completely unresponsive, she sobbed, and the paramedics were already loading him into the back of an ambulance to rush him to the hospital. Under normal circumstances, prior to the horrific discovery in the HR portal, my blood would have run cold. I would have dropped everything, sprinted to my charge nurse to beg for emergency leave, and rushed to the emergency room in a state of blind panic to be by my family's side. But as I stood there in the bright, sterile hallway of the ICU, my heart rate didn't elevate by a single beat. I felt entirely clinically cold. It was a purely observational kind of awareness. I told Linda I would meet them down in the ER. I didn't run. I calmly finished my paperwork, handed off my patients to the incoming shift, and took the employee elevator down to the ground floor. When I pushed through the heavy double doors into the chaotic emergency room waiting area, the scene was exactly what I expected. Jake was furiously pacing back and forth across the cheap linoleum floor, his hands running nervously through his hair. Tyler was sitting in a corner chair, violently bouncing his leg up and down, looking completely out of his depth. Linda was huddled in a plastic chair, clutching a damp tissue and rocking slightly back and forth. Jake saw me first. He rushed over and grabbed my shoulders, pulling me into a hug that I didn't return. He frantically explained that the doctors were back there with Ron right now, running panels and trying to stabilize his vitals. We waited for over an hour in that tense, suffocating atmosphere. Finally, the ER physician, a man I vaguely knew from my rotations, came out into the waiting room. He looked exhausted, but he gave us the news we were waiting for. Ron was stable, but the collapse was severe. His body was failing under the strain of the ongoing kidney issues, and he absolutely needed to be formally admitted for an extended, specialized hospital stay and immediate intervention. The collective sigh of relief from the Carter family was palpable. Linda praised God, Jake slumped against the wall, and Tyler stopped bouncing his leg. But working in a hospital teaches you a very hard truth. Saving a life is the medical part, paying for it is the administrative part. And hospitals are fundamentally merciless businesses. Less than 5 minutes after the doctor walked away, the dreaded hospital administration coordinator approached our small group. She was holding a digital tablet and had that practiced, overly polite smile that billing departments use when they are about to ask you for an exorbitant amount of money. She introduced herself, verified Ron's basic demographic information with Linda, and then got straight to the point. The hospital was asking for the primary insurance information to process Ron's admission and secure a bed in the specialized ward. Jake didn't even flinch. He didn't look worried or stressed about the financial implication of a massive, multi-day hospital stay with specialized treatments. He simply puffed out his chest with that familiar, entitled confidence, waved his hand casually in my direction, and looked right at the billing coordinator. "My wife handles it," Jake told her smoothly. He expected me to step forward, just like I always did. He expected me to reach into my wallet, pull out my premium hospital employee insurance card, and instantly make the massive, crushing financial burden disappear into thin air. He thought the magic spell was going to work one more time. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't reach for my purse. I stood perfectly still under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room, looked Jake dead in the eye, and spoke with a level of terrifying, icy calm that I didn't even know I possessed. "Not anymore," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the sudden, heavy silence. Jake blinked, clearly not comprehending the words coming out of my mouth. He let out a nervous, confused little chuckle. "Emily, come on. Just give her the card so they can get Dad up to a room." "I don't have a card for him, Jake," I replied, my tone flat and unwavering. The administration coordinator looked awkwardly between the two of us, sensing the immediate, intense hostility. She tapped a few keys on her tablet, pulling up the hospital's internal network to search for the records herself. She frowned deeply, her brow furrowing as she scrolled through the screen. She cleared her throat, shifting her weight uncomfortably, and looked directly at Jake and Linda. She formally informed the family that, according to the system, Ron Carter was no longer listed as a dependent on my premium health insurance plan, and because he had no other valid secondary insurance on file, coverage for his immediate admission was officially denied. The family was completely, utterly stunned. It was like watching a live-action painting of absolute shock. Jake's mouth physically dropped open, his eyes wide and terrified as the reality of her words hit him. Tyler froze in his seat, the color completely draining from his face. Linda let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, clutching her chest as if someone had just physically struck her. They couldn't compute it. Their brains simply could not process the fact that their personal, bottomless ATM had finally, permanently shut down without warning. "What do you mean denied?" Jake stammered, his voice rising in panic, turning to the coordinator. "She's an employee here. She has premium coverage. Just run it again." "Sir, the coverage was terminated," the coordinator said gently but firmly. "If you cannot provide an alternate form of insurance, we will need to discuss an immediate out-of-pocket deposit to process the admission to the ward." Jake turned to me, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Emily, what the hell is she talking about? What did you do?" "I think you have bigger things to worry about right now than me," I told him quietly. I didn't stay to watch them scramble. I didn't stay to listen to them beg the billing department for a payment plan, or watch them realize exactly how much a single night in a specialized hospital bed actually costs. I simply turned around on my heel and walked straight out of the yard doors, out into the rainy parking lot, and drove home. The fallout from that afternoon was swift and brutal. My phone essentially exploded. Jake called me no less than 20 times. When I didn't answer, the text messages started pouring in. They ranged from furious demands for an explanation to desperate, pathetic begging. I ignored every single one of them until finally, the next morning, he sent a text demanding a full family dinner at our house that evening. He said we needed to talk, that I was being completely irrational, and that we needed to figure out a plan for his father. I replied with a single word: "Fine." That evening, the atmosphere in my dining room was unimaginably toxic, heavy with unsaid accusations and simmering rage. They all arrived looking like a bruised, battered army. Ron was obviously still at the hospital, but Jake, Linda, and Tyler sat around my polished mahogany table like they were preparing for a war tribunal. The moment I walked into the room, Linda launched into her performance. She didn't even wait for me to sit down. She immediately started sobbing, producing fake tears that she wiped away frantically with a cloth napkin. "You're letting him die," Linda screamed at me, her voice cracking with manufactured grief and intense emotional manipulation. "How could you do this to us, Emily? How could you abandon your own father-in-law when he needs you the most?" Jake slammed his hand down on the table, pointing an angry finger at me. "Fix this, Emily. Call HR right now and get him back on the policy. You are destroying this family." I didn't yell back. I didn't cry. I didn't try to defend myself against their insane, entitled accusations. I simply walked over to the head of the table, reached into my large tote bag, and pulled out the thick, heavy manila folder I had painstakingly compiled over the last 3 days. I placed it squarely in the center of the dining table. The loud, solid thwack of the folder hitting the wood echoed through the room, instantly silencing Linda's fake sobbing. They all stared at the unassuming brown folder, like it was an explosive device. I unhooked the string closure, opened the flap, and slowly, deliberately pulled out the first piece of paper. I slid step 1 across the table. It was a meticulously detailed, multi-page, itemized Excel spreadsheet of every single medical payment, therapy session, out-of-network surgery, and copay I had personally funded over the last 5 years. I had highlighted the final cell at the very bottom of the last page in bright yellow. The bolded total read exactly $287,000. The room went completely, terrifyingly silent. The absolute shock that washed over their faces was visceral. Jake stared at the number, his eyes tracking the zeros as if trying to comprehend the sheer, devastating magnitude of the financial blood they had drained from me. $287,000. That was the physical, mathematical representation of my exhaustion, my missed holidays, my grueling night shifts, and my sacrificed youth. Before any of them could formulate a pathetic excuse or try to justify the spreadsheet, I reached back into the folder. I pulled out step 2 and placed it right on top of the financial ledger. It was the official, stamped insurance cancellation letter from my hospital's HR department, permanently and irrevocably revoking all of their access to my premium health benefits. Total, chaotic panic immediately set in. Tyler shifted violently in his chair, rubbing his face with his hands, realizing his expensive, boutique therapy sessions were entirely over. Jake's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he read the undeniable proof that the gravy train had completely derailed. "Emily," Jake whispered, the anger draining from his voice, replaced by genuine fear. "What are you doing? Why are you doing this to us?" "I'm not done," I said coldly. I reached into the folder one last time. I pulled out step 3, the final, devastating bomb. I slammed the employer supplemental life insurance policy printout down onto the table, right in front of Jake and Linda. The paper landed with a sharp smack. I tapped my index finger forcefully right on the section that listed Linda Carter as the sole beneficiary of my death. I leaned forward, planting both of my hands firmly on the edge of the dining table, closing the distance between me and the people who had actively preyed on my kindness. I looked directly into my mother-in-law's widened, suddenly terrified eyes. "You didn't just expect me to pay for you," I said, my voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that cut through the silence like a knife. "You expected to profit from me." The room absolutely exploded. It was total pandemonium. Linda violently pushed her chair back, clamping both of her hands over her mouth, her face draining of all color as she let out a high-pitched, desperate wail of denial. Tyler looked wildly between the forged policy, his mother, and his brother, clearly realizing for the first exact time just how incredibly dark and twisted his family's dynamic had actually gotten. Jake jumped up from his chair so fast it tipped over backwards, crashing loudly against the hardwood floor. He lunged toward the table, his face a mask of absolute panic and desperation. "It was just security," Jake yelled defensively, desperately trying to spin the horrific narrative, trying to make himself look like a responsible, forward-thinking husband rather than a parasitic monster. "It was just a financial safety net, Emily. That's all." I laughed. It was a harsh, bitter, ugly sound that completely silenced his pathetic shouting. "For who?" I snapped back, my eyes burning with 5 years of suppressed rage and absolute exhaustion. "Me or you?" He had no answer. He just stood there, breathing heavily, entirely trapped in the web of his own grotesque greed. That was the exact moment the entire house of cards completely collapsed. I didn't hold anything back. I looked at Jake with absolute, unadulterated disgust and told the entire table exactly what I knew. I told them that I had already spoken directly to the insurance agent. I told them that I had the exact digital footprint, the specific IP address logged from our shared home computer, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jake had logged into my secure employee portal and forged my digital signature to authorize the policy. Jake completely froze. The remaining blood rushed entirely out of his face as the sheer, terrifying reality of committing actual, verifiable corporate insurance fraud finally caught up to his undeniable entitlement. He wasn't just a bad husband anymore. He was a criminal. Linda immediately started screaming again, a chaotic, desperate wail, waving her hands in the air and trying to deny any involvement, entirely ignoring the fact that her name was typed in bold letters as the sole beneficiary of the fraud. Through the entire chaotic explosion, my brother-in-law Tyler sat entirely, disturbingly silent. He stared blankly at the table, completely paralyzed by the horrifying truth of what his mother and brother had done to the woman who had kept them all afloat. In the background, I could imagine Ron, still lying frail in his hospital bed, quietly crying as his family's grotesque greed systematically destroyed everything they had. I calmly reached down, zipped up my purse, and threw it over my shoulder. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. I stopped right at the doorway of the dining room, looking back at the man I thought had been my safe harbor, the man I had sacrificed everything to protect. "You didn't marry a nurse," I told Jake, my voice completely steady, cold, and brutally final. "You acquired an asset." And with that final, devastating truth ringing in the air, I turned around and walked right out the front door, leaving them entirely to the wreckage they had built. The drive away from that toxic dining room was the most profoundly peaceful experience of my entire adult life. I didn't speed, I didn't cry, and I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove through the rainy Chicago streets, listening to the rhythmic hum of my tires against the wet pavement, feeling a literal weight lifting off my shoulders with every single mile that put distance between me and the Carter family. For 5 brutal years, my brain had been a chaotic, swirling vortex of medical copays, scheduling out-of-network specialists, and picking up grueling overtime shifts just to keep their heads above water. But in that car, staring at the taillights in front of me, there was nothing but a beautiful, blank, echoing silence. I filed for divorce the very next morning. There was absolutely no hesitation, no agonizing over the decision, no pathetic attempts at couples counseling, and zero room for any kind of negotiation. I walked into the office of a ruthless, no-nonsense family law attorney, sat down at her polished glass desk, and handed over my meticulously compiled manila folder. She took one look at the itemized financial spreadsheet, the canceled premium insurance documents, and the undeniably forged life insurance policy, and she immediately went to work. Jake, predictably, completely lost his mind during the fallout. He went from being a smug, entitled son to a desperate, panicking shell of a man overnight. My phone blew up for weeks with a fluctuating mix of pathetic begging and aggressive gaslighting. One voicemail would be him sobbing uncontrollably, pleading with me to come home, promising that he would pay me back every single cent and that we could fix his family's mess together. The next voicemail, left only 3 hours later, would be him screaming at the top of his lungs, calling me a heartless monster, and blaming me for actively destroying his family. I didn't answer a single call or reply to a single text. I let my lawyer handle every piece of communication, maintaining that same clinical, icy detachment that had allowed me to survive the ICU all these years. But I didn't just file for divorce and walk away quietly. I systematically triggered the severe legal consequences of his actions. I officially reported the forged electronic signature on the supplemental life insurance policy to the insurance company's fraud department, initiating a full, relentless insurance fraud investigation. Corporate entities do not take kindly to financial liability or identity theft, and they moved with terrifying speed. The digital footprint was completely undeniable. The IP address logged for the digital signature traced directly back to the shared desktop computer sitting in our home office. Jake wasn't just facing a messy, incredibly expensive divorce anymore. He was staring down the barrel of severe legal and criminal consequences for orchestrating corporate fraud. The panic in the Carter family must have been absolute, but I only heard about the wreckage from a safe distance through legal filings and the hospital grapevine. Without my premium hospital health insurance shielding them from the brutal reality of the American healthcare system, the financial avalanche they had been dodging for half a decade finally hit them. Ron's extended hospital admission, his stay in the specialized ward, and the subsequent life-saving kidney treatments were suddenly completely out-of-pocket expenses. The massive family medical debt piled up faster than any of them could even comprehend. Linda's extravagant, out-of-network knee surgeries and elite, private physical therapy. She felt so entitled to suddenly came back to haunt her when the aggressive medical collection agencies started calling her phone day and night. And Tyler? Tyler finally had to abandon his imaginary startup ventures and abruptly stop his exorbitant boutique therapy sessions because there was simply no one left to casually swipe a credit card for his existential crises. The ultimate, poetic irony of the entire situation was that their relentless greed cost them the exact thing they had originally used to trap me. The beloved family house that Jake had cried about losing when Ron first got sick, the very house I had sacrificed my own youth, my sleep, and my savings to protect, was finally lost. The mounting family medical debts and the crushing legal fees required to defend Jake from the fraud investigation became entirely too much for them to bear. A massive lien was placed on the house. Linda and Ron were forced to drastically downsize, packing up the pristine patio where they had once sat, sipped sweet iced tea, and casually laughed about the financial benefits of my premature death. As for me, the divorce was finalized relatively quickly because Jake had absolutely zero leverage to fight me on the division of assets while a pending fraud investigation hung over his head. I walked away completely clean. I kept my retirement accounts intact, I kept my separate savings that I had hidden away, and most importantly, I kept my sanity, finally leaving me completely, wonderfully free. I moved into a beautiful, quiet apartment closer to the hospital, filled it with things that I loved, and never looked back. I still work in the ICU. I still work long, demanding shifts, and my feet still ache at the end of the day. But the fundamental difference now is that the money I earn through my blood, sweat, and tears belongs entirely to me. I don't dread checking my bank account balance anymore, and I don't have panic attacks about phantom ER visits or sudden, manipulative demands for $22,000. Sometimes, when the hospital ward is quiet at 3 a.m. and the life support monitors are beeping in their steady, rhythmic way, I think back to that blistering hot summer barbecue. I think about the sheer ease with which my own family calculated my worth while I bought their food and served their drinks. They insured my life, but they built their survival on my death. The day I stopped paying was the day I stopped belonging to them.